And I was a little boy in the corner of my parents' living room. Standing in that corner was an oar, 7 feet long. And the family story was that oar had been carved by my great-great-grandfather Elijah back after the Civil War. Now, the reason Elijah had that oar is that he was a member of the United States Life-Saving Service. And the United States Life-Saving Service had 3 requirements for membership. Requirement number 1 is that you had to live on the coast, near where ships passed. And he lived in West Islip, South Shore, Long Island. Requirement number 2 is that you had to be willing to go out in terrible weather, in stormy weather, in fierce, life-threatening weather to rescue sailors who were foundering or who had capsized and who were at risk of losing their lives. And requirement number 3 is you had to bring your own oar. So he had that one that he carved himself out of eastern red cedar. Now, when I finally got around to graduating from high school and went off to college, I set out to major in physics and philosophy. That was my goal. But instead, I quickly adopted 4 other majors. I majored in the peace movement. I majored in the civil rights movement. I majored in free speech, and I majored in smoking dope. And between my 4 auxiliary majors, I didn't do all that well with my principal majors, and after a couple of years, my grades had gotten so far down that I was at risk of being drafted. As a matter of fact, I was certainly going to be drafted and sent to Vietnam. Well, I didn't like the war in Vietnam, didn't believe in it, and so I decided to go home and tell my parents that I had decided I was going to be a political exile in Canada. So I went to my parents' house to tell them that I was leaving the next day and they probably would never see me again. My father bit down hard on the stem of his pipe and glared at me, but he didn't say anything. My mom said, "Good riddance, I'll drive you to the bus station and buy your ticket." To my surprise, my grandmother was there that day. I hadn't expected her. And she burst into tears. And she wept so hard that her shoulders shook and she couldn't lift her head. And behind her stood my great-great-grandfather's oar. So I changed my mind. And the next day, I got a haircut and went down to the Coast Guard recruiter and joined up. Figured I'd spend the war saving lives if I could. Well, it takes about 16 weeks to graduate from boot camp, so 16 weeks later, I got my assignment. I was assigned to Galveston Station in Galveston, Texas, on the Gulf of Mexico. Now, I'll tell you right now, Galveston Station is a fabulous assignment. Subtropical environment. The station itself is beautiful, rolling green lawns with buildings, white masonry buildings up on masonry piles. It was just beautiful. And my assignment was perfect. Search and rescue. I was going to go right into the business of life-saving. The boat that I was assigned to was a 30-foot rescue boat. Now, a 30-foot rescue boat is an astonishing piece of equipment. It has a steel hull. In the very bow, there's a cubby cabin into which one person can just barely fit. Behind that is the helm. And the helm is where the coxswain sits. And he sits in a chair and he's strapped in and he's got the wheel and he's got the throttles. He's got the radar and the radio and windshields around 3/4 of his vista. He doesn't have to worry about anything, and his word is absolute law. As soon as you cast off the line and leave the shore, he is God. Behind the helm is the engine. It's a 12-cylinder diesel engine. Takes up almost the rest of the boat. There's about this much space between the engine housing and the gunnel that you can just sort of work your way back toward the back of the boat, the stern, but it's a tight fit. And back behind the engine is the towing bit, the crucifix. It's an iron pipe with an iron crossbar, sticks right up out of the hull. It goes through the hull and it's bolted to the keel. And when you pull something, when you pull another boat, you pull them with a line tied to the crucifix or the towing bit. There are 3 people on that boat, 3 crew. There's the engineman, who, as far as I could tell, was absolutely useless if the engine was working. The engineman had no assignment other than to fix the engine if it quit working. So most of the time, the engineman was just a passenger. Then there was the coxswain. I've already mentioned him. He never left the helm, ever, and he was in charge. The third person on that boat was euphemistically referred to as the able-bodied seaman. I never actually heard anybody say able-bodied seaman. That was language that you would see in writing or on chalkboards and stuff. But the way people always referred to that person was as the deck ape. I was the deck ape. And the deck ape is the person who does the work of rescue when you arrive at the destination. So duty out of Galveston was sweet. The weather was lovely. We had tropical breezes coming in and off the Gulf of Mexico. Seldom did we have bad weather. And even when we had bad weather, it wasn't that bad. And it was just wonderful. And we'd go out and pull in fishermen who'd capsized or recreational boaters who'd managed to get themselves lost or washed up someplace. And it was pretty much kind of a cushy job. There was one thing that I really, really hated. Sometimes we'd be sent out to retrieve a floater. Now, a floater is a dead body. And the good news is 75 or 80% of the time we'd go out looking for floaters, we wouldn't find them because, they're hard to find. On those occasions when we did find the one we were sent out to find, as the able-bodied seaman, as the deck ape, it was my job to maneuver it into the body bag and zip it up and bring it on board. And there's no nastier work on earth if that thing's been in the water for very long. So I hated that. That was grim. And I developed a healthy respect for dead bodies. But life in general was pretty good. Life in general was pretty good. And then we heard the announcement that there was a huge hurricane headed right for Galveston. It was definitely going to produce a very significant storm surge. It was going to go right over our end of the island. And so we issued a mandatory emergency small vessel advisory, figuring that would let people know. I mean, the whole point of that is to let people know that if they go out, they may not come back, and we may not be able to find them and bring them back, and so don't go. Well, that done, we evacuated the base. Everybody on that base and all the boats on that base were shipped up went up the Houston ship channel to avoid the storm. But one search and rescue crew had to stay behind. Mine. We won the lottery. So we're spending the storm. Everybody else is gone. We're spending the storm in the Coast Guard big building, up on the pilings, water roaring underneath us, storm shutters slamming and bamming on the windows, drinking Coast Guard coffee, looking at magazines, playing spades and hearts, and cribbage, and pinochle, and we got the call. Somebody out on the Buccaneer oil rig had spotted a shrimp boat out at sea. The booms were down, the nets were full of shrimp, and the crew were standing on deck shooting flares and waving their arms around and trying to get the attention of the oil rig. And they had succeeded, and so we were sent out. We launched the boat, and it took us 15 hours to find that shrimp boat. 15 hours of the wind coming at you from every possible direction. 15 hours of the waves crashing over the boat. 15 hours of horrendous, frightening tedium. The engineman was in the cubby cabin forward of the helm. The coxswain was strapped into his chair. I was lashed to the towing bit in the stern of the boat. I was having a hard time finding that space between waves and rain where you could breathe. 15 hours. Finally, we found the boat. And it was time to bring it in. Well, the coxswain gets downwind of the boat, gets upwind of the boat, and he's backing into the boat, backing and filling and backing and filling and backing and filling, and the boats are going like this. And so the boat and I are on opposite elevators, and I'm busy trying to, wait a minute, time out. This is a throwing line, and on the end of the throwing line is a fancy knot called a monkey's fist. And my job was to throw the monkey's fist over to the other boat with the throwing line attached to it. Every bosun and every able-bodied seaman in the Coast Guard has one of these, and they tie it themselves. It's a requirement. In order for it to be any good, it's got a really big steel ball bearing or a hunk of lead in the middle of it, so it's got some heft, so you can throw it through high winds to get it to the other boat. But about 2 weeks before the storm, somebody had thrown one of these and conked somebody on the head with it, and the admiral of the Coast Guard had announced that henceforth all monkey's fists would no longer have a hunk of metal in them. They'd have a hunk of kapok, which is Mother Nature's styrofoam. Well, after that, every seaman and every bosun who was worth his salt had two monkey's fists. One with a hunk of kapok in it for inspections, and one with a hunk of lead in it for throwing. Well, somehow I'd managed to get out on that 30 boat 15 hours into the hellacious storm, backing up to the shrimp boat. I grabbed my monkey's fist, and I had the wrong one. I had the one with the kapok center. Well, I tried to use it, and I hauled off, and the boats are doing this, and every time we got about the right place, I'd throw that thing as hard as I could. Whoa! And the wind would carry it. And I'd try again. Whoa! And the wind would carry it. I did that about 3 times, and I looked back, and the coxswain was offering some helpful instruction. I couldn't hear a word he was saying, but I could tell that it was helpful. It looked like this. Well, I didn't know what to do. And then I saw the engineman doing the only really useful thing I ever saw an engineman do. He was crawling on the deck of that boat between the gunwale and the engine housing back to me. And when he got back to me, he handed me a big, beautiful wrench. And I tied that wrench onto the end of my throwing line, and I threw it over to the other boat. It landed on the deck. Somebody dove on it, and we had our communication established. At that point, I sent over a carbide steel fire axe and a little slate. And the slate said, "Cut your booms off." And the captain of that boat went, and I went, this being my clasp knife, letting him know that he could cut the booms off or I'd cut him off. So and then he cut them off. And several $1,000s worth of equipment and several $1,000s worth of shrimp went straight to the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. And his boat quit wallowing around so much. And I sent him over the hawser. And the hawser is a braided nylon rope about that big in diameter. And we paid out about 100 feet of it, and I watched him hitch it onto the standing post of his bow. We got about 100 feet of it, or maybe 150 feet of it out, and I hitched it to the towing bit, which means that his boat and I are tied to the same hunk of metal. And then we gradually took the slack out, and then we headed for shore. And you know what? The trip home wasn't that bad, because he was acting like a sea anchor, and it was kind of a steady ride, and we were only going in one direction, which meant that the coxswain could quarter into the waves and wind and minimize the turbulence and make it a little easier. And the storm was beginning to die down. It had kind of passed over. And I thought, wow, that's the end of that. We're good. And then we got to these 2-mile-long jetties that stick out from Galveston Harbor, Galveston Bay, out into the Gulf of Mexico. And the wind and the hurricane had piled up the water between those jetties, and there were 60-foot rollers headed straight in, and there was nothing we could do but ride them. Well, these rollers are like this. Well, some of the time, on my boat, I don't even see the shrimp boat. He's on the other side of the roller. All I can see is my hawser going out about 15 or 20 feet and disappearing into the side of the wave. And then we get to the bottom of the roller, and he comes over the top. And he comes screaming down the face of that wave like a locomotive, and we're just struggling and struggling and struggling to get out of the bottom, and the hawser's piling up in between us, and I swear he's going to slam into the stern of our boat, but every time we got out of there just in time. And then we would get to the top of the wave just as he was starting up, and that hawser would snap tight like a rubber band, and it would scream. It'd go, whing! Now, in boot camp, they showed me a training film of what happens when a hawser snaps under that kind of strain. And what it does is it sweeps the deck of the boat. It takes the engine and the helm and the cubby cabin and the engineer and the coxswain and the able-bodied seaman right off. And I knew it was going to happen to us. And all the way in, those rollers, as we're coming into Galveston, I've never been so scared in my whole life. Every couple of minutes, whing! And that thing's singing like a stuck rubber band. But the truth is, we made it in. We made it into the harbor and tied up at the pier, and the captain of the shrimp boat came over and told me he was going to sue me. And he was going to sue the coxswain, and he was going to sue the commandant of the base, and he was going to sue the commandant of the Coast Guard, and he was going to sue the President of the United States if he had to, because he wanted his money back for those booms and the lost harvest of those shrimp. While he was doing that, the coxswain was writing him a citation for going out, even though there had been a mandatory emergency small vessel warning. While the coxswain was at it, he inspected the boat and found several other things wrong. Not quite enough life jackets, the fire extinguisher was dead, yada, yada. And so it all ended kind of quietly there at the dock. And I went on to several other duty stations while I was in the Coast Guard, and I enjoyed my time in the Coast Guard a whole lot. I really, really appreciated all of the experiences I had there. And eventually I got out of the Coast Guard and went back to college, where I turned in 4 consecutive semesters of straight A's and wrapped things up, and got on with my professional career. While I was in the Coast Guard saved a lot of lives. And sometimes I had something to do with that, and I felt really, really good about that. I felt really good about the fact that I had helped save some lives. But my great-great-grandfather, Elijah, from 150 years into the past, saved a life too. One more life, mine.